History is being written as we speak, and I think it's really important for us to acknowledge what is going on right now in the podcasting world before this becomes very common, because it doesn't take a genius to see how podcasting played a major role in the US election and how this has never been done before. This video is not going to be a political video by any means. I'm simply using the situation because it's so undeniable, it's so unignorable, and like I said, it is a part of history. This is something that if you are like me and you've been a part of the podcasting community since 2012, this is a crazy exciting time to see people finally taking this medium seriously. So I'm going to extract all the lessons that I can from the strategies of both candidates, what stood out, and what we can learn from the aftermath of many of these things. Now, it's important to know that Donald Trump and Kamala Harris were not actually the first ones to begin using this strategy. They were simply the ones where the limelight was shined on them because they were the presidential candidates. The strategy actually goes back years and years when Andrew Yang, Bernie Sanders, and Tulsi Gabbard actually paved the way for what we are seeing today. They went on the Joe Rogan podcast, and it was kind of unheard of to see any politician speaking for any longer than like 10 seconds without somebody interrupting or, a commercial break happening. Because if you think about the longest that a politician has typically spoken unfiltered, it is no longer than maybe a 60-minute segment on CNN, which we already know is edited down and probably massaged into what the politician actually wants to portray. Earlier this year, you had RFK Jr. and Vivek Ramaswamy both going on as many podcasts as they could possibly go on. And at the same time, you had all these billionaires. You had Elon Musk, you had Jeff Bezos, you had Mark Zuckerberg. They were also going on all of the different podcasts. And so what this began to do was test the waters in a low stakes scenario. And then all of a sudden, when it really came down to Donald Trump and Kamala Harris having to run and really using these strategies, let's learn the first lesson that came out of all of this. If you take a look at Donald Trump, he went on so many different podcasts, and most of them were at least an hour, if not 2-3 hours long, where even if you are not a fan of him, or even if that was not the candidate you're voting for, it becomes a piece of content where even haters would want to tune in and watch to see how this person is thinking. And because the editing is not so crazy in podcasts, more particularly with somebody like Joe Rogan, they say, hey, we're not going to edit this down. That signals the next thing, which is high trust. Okay. High trust is a reason why podcasting is being used in the first place. It is not typically the common choice when it comes to getting attention. Okay. Social media like Instagram and TikTok, all that stuff is a little bit better for just capturing attention. But once you've got the attention and you need to build trust and you need to do it at scale, podcasts and YouTube videos and long form pieces of content are the way. The next finding that I found kind of funny was that Trump was actually using the same strategies that we all use in the podcasting world, which I called web working, right? He's going from person to person. He started with Theo Von. Okay. Then after that, he went on Andrew Schultz's podcast, right? And what you're doing is you're getting closer and closer to the person whose show you really want to be on, which in this case was Rogan, because obviously Rogan has tens of millions of listeners that beat any other media appearance that you could possibly have. So what happens when you've got your friends who have already said yes to the president-elect and they have had him on, they seem to have a great time, their careers are still going, they weren't canceled or anything. And this is something that if you watch the Joe Rogan podcast with Donald Trump, he has admitted then and even after, the main reason that he had him on was because of Dana White, right? Dana White, who his boss at the UFC, was somebody who was like, being like, dude, you got to have him on. It would make such a big difference, blah, blah. And it did, right? But would he have said yes if he was the first person to have Trump on? I don't think so. I think it's because Trump had proven himself to be a decent guest, okay? Because if he went on, let's say, Theo Von's podcast, that first appearance that he did, and he blew it, Theo's career's down the drain, and, Trump said some things that made everybody look bad brand association. Everyone else would have thought twice before inviting him on the show. The next lesson is why we're doing this video in the first place, which is if you can use podcasting for something that's a very, very difficult and it works, that goes a long way. That strategy goes a long way. And comedians traditionally are the only people we can look at who have pulled this off successfully, right? So you've got comedians who their main product is getting butts in seats. It's selling tickets, right? Selling bigger and bigger clubs out, then selling theaters out, and then selling arenas out. So for years, comedians have proved that, hey, you can go from being a nobody to, if you have a podcast, you can build your own audience and they will come see you when you're in their city. That's a proven thing now. So when you look at something like the election, where it takes so much to get somebody to get to a comedy show, you got to get babysitting, maybe you got to go get parking, you got to drive far, like all these different things, 2-drink minimum. It's a whole night out. So if people show up for you, that's a big deal. It means that they really appreciate what you have to offer. Similarly, in politics, what is the hardest thing to do? It's getting somebody to leave the comfort of their home, show up, stand in line, and actually vote, right? That's the whole messaging behind election season, is like, get out and vote, right? And so that was the main call to action out of all of this. And to see that it worked, right? It drove people who normally would not come out, would not take the time to take that valuable action. Podcasts built enough trust with these people that they were actually able to go out and take the action which was intended, which I would personally say is even harder than buying tickets to a comedy show, because at least you know you're going to laugh, you're going to enjoy, you're going to have a good time. But with something like going out and voting, right, you have to really move somebody and inspire them enough to believe in your cause that they would be willing to go do that. So the lesson from this is how comedians and politicians have proven how podcasts work in the hardest of scenarios, the hardest actions that you might be trying to actually get people to take. It works for that, which is comforting, because if you and I are making digital products or we're offering services and things like that, all of a sudden it makes it seem doable that we can use podcasting to build trust for our thing. You know, we're not asking somebody to get in a car and drive to a stadium and watch us for 2 hours, right? Our ask might be much simpler. And so it is encouraging to see that happen. The next lesson is around cheesiness. So podcasting, let's be real, has been something that's considered cheesy. It's made fun of, right? When you kind of think about it on a mainstream level, it has traditionally been a joke. And this is somebody who's been consuming since 2012 and creating since 2016. I've gotten to see the attitudes of people and how this has evolved over the years. So let this be a lesson that when something feels cheesy, it typically means that you're early, because a lot of people wait for it to not be cheesy so that they can get started. Which, by the way, after this election season, I have seen an uptick in terms of people reaching out to me and considering starting their show and really being inspired to do so after seeing that it has been validated in so many ways. But if you're going to wait for everything that you do to have that kind of certainty, you are entering markets when they're already saturated and it's already too late. I'm not saying that's the case with podcasting, because we're clearly still early. There are only a total of 5 million podcasts worldwide. So this is a pattern that I noticed when TikTok came out, when YouTube came out, when every platform has come out and it's a new thing. You're going to have the phase where it's cheesy, people make fun of it, and it honestly deters a lot of people from starting. But let me tell you something, the very same people that would make fun of this entire medium, I am seeing those exact celebrities, those exact comedians, those exact educators coming to the world of podcasting and now enjoying it. So it's a very important takeaway, because if you had been creating since 2012, 2016, when it was cheesy, that's kind of the only way that you've gotten to a point now where you have enough mass of an audience where these big politicians even consider asking you. Which leads me to the next crazy part. You have to think about the dynamics of what it was like for Trump and Harris to both ask these people to come on their show, because they had to do research to figure out, oh, this is where a mass amount of attention is. We need this appearance. This is going to connect us with our target viewers and listeners, and hopefully voters. Now, if you were the person who was being asked, hey, can I come on your show? It's a pretty big deal, right? You feel enamored no matter whether you like or hate the candidate. You're like, wow, I can't believe I was asked. This is historical. You're going to do it probably because of just how historically significant it is. And like, you could tell your family that you did that decades and decades from now, and it would be pretty wild. So that celebrity effect is also what took place here with every single person that was asked to host Trump or Harris. They almost felt a sense of, hey, this is like my patriotic duty. Like, this is a big deal. I have to do it. I mean, I can't say no. I also want to remind you that probably the earliest podcast that ever happened with a politician was actually with Barack Obama. He went on the WTF podcast with Mark Maron, and that was kind of like this epic big deal. Like, whoa, he flew out and he came to your garage and he did it in the space that you normally rant and complain. Like, it was just a crazy, mind-blowing experience to see that a president would go do that. But he did that at the time. Why? Because there was a mass amount of attention there, along with all of these other traditional places like NPR and CNN and Fox and MSN, all the different networks that are out there. Mark Maron at the time had enough of an audience, right, that was enough to rival one of those networks. Because you have to understand, these aren't just regular people that have all the time in the world to do as many of these media appearances. They have to choose very strategically and very selectively. So that's also why it was a big deal that these politicians were choosing podcasting as the way to go. Because it's like, if you clearly are limited on time and you're putting your attention into this, it signals to the world that this is important. And so this is a broader theme that changes how things will be done in the future, not just in politics, but business in general, right? People are going to go to the places where there is an audience formed, not necessarily just decades and centuries of trusted networks, because a lot of times that's why these networks have existed, because there's trust for decades upon decades upon decades. But over time, these mainstream networks have abused that trust that the common people have in them. And it has actually been the perfect moment for independent media like podcasting and YouTube to come in and replace that. I mean, think about it for a second. Could we ever have predicted that when Tucker Carlson left Fox, that he was going to have one of the top 5, top 10 podcasts in the entire country? No. So you're already seeing the effects of this happening, right? You have major people at certain networks. I actually had somebody who worked for 7 years at CNN who reached out to me and was interested in, doing their own show. And then you hear publicly somebody like Chris Wallace, also working at CNN, he's going off to go do streaming and podcasting. It sounds funny, right? It sounds like, oh, what a waste of your life, right? Like, what a waste of time. But that's what I'm talking about. That feeling is something that every one of these podcasters that got to host these big people had on. They had to go through the feeling when their friends all thought it was a waste of time, when their coworkers would maybe make fun of them. The next thing I have to mention about Kamala Harris's strategy was how she selectively chose not to go on the Joe Rogan podcast and the Theo Von podcast, even though she was invited. So both people, and I'm sure many more, went on to publicly say, hey, I also invited the other side. I would love to have a conversation with them, but then obviously they got to come into the studio, right? The other clause that came out with Joe Rogan is the fact that he doesn't edit down his shows, which would rightly make someone nervous as a politician who is used to very highly edited down stuff. But as you can see, this defeats the very purpose of why people are coming on to podcasts in the first place, why they're listening, is because they want an uncut, unfiltered, raw type of vibe from that person. So let's talk about one of the reasons of why she might have said no, despite having an open, welcoming invite from these major players. My take on it is that she recognized two things. Number one, if she went on Joe Rogan, she went on Theo Von, those audiences already have a good sense of who they like and who they're going to vote for. So she may have seen it as not worth it to go on and potentially embarrass herself and come out not winning any of those voters. And of course, the second reason of why I think she didn't go on is because it would have had more of a negative effect than a positive one. Because when you go on somebody like Joe Rogan's show, where you're going to be talking continuously for 2 hours, 3 hours, the chances of you slipping up and saying something that is not right or making a certain look on your face that can be broken down later It's very high. And so her and her team may have decided, you know what, the risk of this going bad is not worth the positive that might be able to come from this. After looking at it, it doesn't make sense. But here's partly why I think that that was a mistake, even though I understand those two reasons for not going on. The reason I believe it was a mistake for Kamala Harris not to go on Joe Rogan or Theo Von, despite once again being invited, the piece of content that she would have actually came out with is not for Joe Rogan's audience or Theo Von's audience in this case. It would have been for all of her voters. So all of the people that were on her side, the people that were considering voting for her, who normally don't listen to Joe Rogan at all, or Theo Von they had never heard of. But maybe now, because this long form piece of media is out, they would actually take the time to listen to it because they want to know, hey, what does this person think? They want a chance at affirming the fact that they're considering voting for you, right? So that's where I think it was a big missed opportunity, is that it could have been an hour or 2 hour piece of content that, yes, may not be for the original audience there, but that would have traveled. Those clips, that episode would have been broken down by so many people afterwards that at least you had some space and some chance to get a lot of your views out there. Of course, the next thing we can't ignore is the fact that $1 billion was spent on the Harris campaign, which with that kind of money, I would have bought sponsorships and appearances on every podcast that I could possibly think of. Because I guarantee you, in the world of podcasting, what was a little different than the world of celebrities that Kamala Harris used is that we're finding out now, right, that the celebrities were being paid. So Oprah got paid for actually endorsing her, versus if you are an everyday podcaster, right? Even if you are now technically famous, you're kind of blown away by the fact that you even have this opportunity. Your brain is not going, oh, I'm going to charge $100 million for this appearance. Your brain is kind of like, whoa, I can't believe he even picked me. So although I think people like Joe Rogan were definitely paid and there was a lot of money, I do think on some of the other shows, it wasn't a necessity. Like, the people didn't need to be paid in order to have him on and do the episode. The benefits from just having a big name and the, future effects of that would come from it was enough for a lot of these people. And again, another way that probably could have saved a ton of costs are the virality effect that comes from podcasts, right? So podcasts are not just going to be consumed on YouTube, but they're going to be traveling through Instagram and TikTok and people doing reaction videos, people pulling long clips, short clips. That's kind of like the new segment that people are going on podcasts for. They're going for the clips. Because a lot of people aren't even going to tune in maybe to the full episode, but you know that they're going to catch the highlights of the clips. The next lesson I want to talk about is transparency. So the perceived level of transparency on the Trump side was very high, right? Even if they were lying in all of the podcast episodes that they did, the fact that they said yes to them and the fact that they showed up and were willing to sit down and do it, that alone signaled high trust because it had never really been done before. Now, if you've watched some of these interviews, not just with Donald Trump, but even, let's say, JD Vance. And now it does not mean that on these podcast episodes, each of the candidates and all the other politicians, that they don't lie, right? It's just that when you lie, it is a little bit harder to walk around, okay? You might have somebody that interrupts you and calls you out on it, or even worse, that person might just let you talk and you keep talking and digging yourself deeper and deeper into a lie. And so it allows those types of truths to surface, or it is at least more likely for it to surface in that format versus something like a cable network where you're like, all right, we're going to cut to the commercial break. And there's a chance for you to cover things up in a way where nobody really would question it. The next lesson is the compounding effect. So if you notice, it is not just Donald Trump and Kamala Harris that went on all of these different podcasts. it comes down to somebody like RFK Jr., right, who has been doing these for quite a while. He's gone on a lot of the major ones, right? Then when you look at Joe Rogan's show, he had on Elon Musk, he had on RFK Jr., he had on Tulsi Gabbard, he had on Donald Trump, he had on JD Vance. So all of a sudden, when you add up 5 major players that are all on technically one side, each one is building trust with that audience, and it is compounding with the next person that comes on, because this is all association and affiliation, right? So now all of a sudden, if let's say you don't like Trump, but you do like RFK Jr., you're like, oh, I love the podcast with him and Bobby Lee on Tiger Belly. All of a sudden, you pair him next to Donald Trump, and the influence just skyrockets, right? Because both of them have their individual trust that they've built with their audiences. And now when you come together, it's like an explosion. So that is why I partly believe that even if Kamala Harris did go on more podcasts and she did those appearances, it would have made a difference, but it may not have actually made the cumulative difference that all of the other people were able to help out with. Because we already know from watching Joe Rogan's show and getting to see other niches now adopt this mentality, podcasts are like watching an Avengers movie, right? You've got Captain America, and you're like, whoa, there's Spider-Man, and oh my gosh, there's you from that movie. It just feels funny because you're not seeing all of these people in one place usually, right? And so it kind of breaks your brain a little bit. But the effect is even more powerful, right? Because in podcasting, you can see this from the world of comedians, but even beyond that, if somebody who is considered cool and awesome has on someone who's not known or not considered cool or awesome, the network effects of podcasting right now are like, okay, we believe what the host believes. If the host likes you, I like you. If the host hates you, I hate you. So there's a massive form of tribalism at play here, which again is the main reason why both candidates and future candidates will use this medium again, because the network effects, the trust factors are so powerful that you'll probably only ignore this strategy if you in fact do have something to hide, and it would work against you, to be open and honest. Because I've said this before, the one aftermath that you are going to see from this is not just US politicians using this in elections to gain influence and earn trust, but you're now going to see this executed worldwide now that the US has proven these strategies. Because one of the things I like to think about is, if you are any world leader in the world and you see that the leader of the free world, or one of the potential leaders of the free world, is going to talk uninterrupted for 3 hours, you would tell one of your assistants to watch that, or you would stop what you're doing and watch that. Mostly because you can get inside somebody's head. That's a long enough time online to get inside the way that somebody thinks. But that doesn't mean that everything you see is true, because that's my next takeaway from this, which is performance, right? So you have people on Trump's side. Trump is technically considered a good performer, right? He's funny. He's been an actor on TV shows. He's somebody who has a sense of performance the same way that a lot of other politicians do. They know how to dodge answers, right? And so if you're talking for an hour and you keep dodging an answer, or you're trying to hide or distract maybe the host, those things become more apparent. So the performative effect is huge, because somebody could be lying, but if they are a really good performer, they're going to be able to pull it off and gain your trust. Remember that if you are a politician or a celebrity, you get media training, you get taught and coached how to be on camera, right? Some things to look out for, what never to do and what to do. And so these are things that the general public doesn't think about when they're consuming a podcast. But at the top levels now, because production and popularity is so high, you have many of these things happening behind the scenes. So the real benefit or takeaway for everyday people like me and you is that we are going to benefit from the byproduct that all of these politicians have created in the world of podcasting. Because if you think about it, there are millions and millions of people in the United States and all over the world who previously may have never heard of a podcast, or they didn't take it seriously, they didn't know how to find one, and all of a sudden they do. So you're going to see a lot of podcasts that are going to actually be coming out even faster than the rate they were coming out at before. But I'll tell you why I find that encouraging. More podcasts mean more conversations, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And it doesn't always scale that way, right? More TikTok accounts might mean more dancing or shorter attention spans. But with something like podcasts, you have an opportunity to put out the types of conversations that you want to see in the world. And if what you're seeing out there is stuff that you don't like, then the best thing that you can do is figure out what you do like and contribute that back to the world. Another major takeaway from all of this is how quickly something can go from being, oh, you're an early adopter, to now being mainstream and now being widely accepted and totally common. So the bright side of more people consuming podcasts, more people creating podcasts, is the fact that you have more activity going on in the industry in general. There's more money pouring into the industry in general, which creates more opportunities. The other thing that I think is kind of important to highlight is the difference between YouTube and audio platforms. So if you think about YouTube, the algorithm is pretty, like, if you watch a Trump video or you watch a video on anything, you are going to get served dozens and dozens more of that, right? The YouTube algorithm is actually pretty good at giving you more of what you indicate you want more of. And so that is another crazy element in all of this, is that a lot of people who consume podcasts who may not even know how to do so would have gone straight to YouTube. And on YouTube, if you've hovered over a video for even 5-10 seconds without actually swiping away, the algorithm picks up on that and you get served more of that in the next few scrolls. So something to think about is how, regardless of which side, Harris and Trump had the opportunity to be served to millions and millions of people in abundance, if they chose to take that first step in consuming them. So if you watched the full Trump interview or you watched the full JD Vance and Rogan interview, guess what? You're going to get all of the different ones that would be coming from that side. And in some ways, you have to make sure that there's enough in the first place. There's enough content to be served about you that is in the positive light that you need it to be. So the fact that the Trump campaign did so many episodes allowed whoever was interested to go down a rabbit hole where they could satisfy the entire 7-11-4 rule that Google has for digital consumer behavior. Yes, that is in regards to people making a purchase or buying something, but you could apply the same thing here, right? People need to consume 7 hours of content with your brand, which was easily made available. They need 11 different touch points, which also was made available because you'd have the full episode, you'd have the clip, you'd have the photos about the fact that the episode happened. And this is not even taking into account all the other classic strategies this was combined with, like mailers. I got a new mailer every single day. It was relentless, sometimes 2 a day. So you have 11 touch points and then you have 4 different locations. So when you see a certain candidate on Instagram, but then they also have something that went viral on Snapchat or whatever, and then they also are on YouTube, and now all of a sudden they're on TV. It's like it creates all of these associations that build trust and push somebody over the edge to making that decision. And in this case, it wasn't a purchase that was the decision, it was the vote, right? And then of course, I think one of the things to think about what goes into a vote is the fact that people need to feel inspired, hopeful, empowered, right? It's often an emotional thing because both sides could be lying about which policies they care about and what they're going to do, right? Most often, 3 years from now, we never come back to some of these clips and go, hey, remember you said this, why didn't this happen? So at the end of the day, a lot of it comes back to emotion. It's not just the policies and people's understanding about it, even though it should be, right? It is the emotions that are associated with that. And there is a natural benefit in podcasting that creates a story arc. So if you've ever noticed, anytime you listen to a new podcast, new host, new guest, notice how you low-key kind of hate them when you first listen, right? You're like, who is this person, right? But then very quickly, within a few minutes, you hear about their struggle or you hear about certain things they're dealing with. There's now a character arc that's beginning to be formed. And by the end of the episode, even if it's 30 minutes or an hour, you've gone from not knowing this person to knowing some of their struggles, some of their pains and fears, hopes and dreams. And you walk away with a more human view of who that person is. And this is not something that has to do with just these politicians. This is something that existed since the very beginning of podcasting. This medium gives space to humanize people, and that is reflected in the trust that it can earn from people, which is why so many advertisers pour money into the genre of podcasting. So the too long to read version is you should start a podcast if you have not already, because you don't want to be another several years from now going, oh man, I should have started one. Now it's too late. It's like, it's not too late. Even though it feels like, oh, there's going to be a lot more, we're nowhere near the capacity that it could get to. You have to keep in mind that some platforms have 1 billion users or more, right? There's only 5 million total people who have created in the world of podcasting. So hopefully this encourages you to be a part of the next 5 million and not wait. Because if we have politicians using podcasting in their strategies to get what they want, it should encourage me and you to use podcasting in our strategies to get what we want. If you enjoyed this, make sure to check out some of the free tools and paid tools that I have in the description below. I think you'll find it useful. And of course, drop a comment. I would love to hear from you. Love to hear your thoughts and takeaways or anything that you noticed that was interesting. This was a fascinating time, and I'm so honored that I got to, one, experience this kind of history with you, but also break it down with you if this was something you found interesting. So thanks again for hanging out, and I will see you on the next one.